Today is May 13th, 2026, and the meeting that happened this week in a conference room somewhere between Ankara, Doha, and Abu Dhabi did not make the front page of a single major Western newspaper. It was not covered by the networks tracking the mosquito fleet in the Strait of Hormuz. It was not mentioned in the diplomatic cables moving through Pakistani mediators between Washington and Tehran. But what was agreed in that meeting, the financing framework for a 1,200-kilometer steel corridor running from the Persian Gulf through Iraq to the Mediterranean coast of Turkey, is more strategically devastating to the Islamic Republic of Iran than every American airstrike, every naval blockade enforcement action, and every CENTCOM imagery release of the past 75 days combined. Because airstrikes destroy hardware, blockades cut revenue, but a 1,200-kilometer trade corridor, once built, permanently removes the geographic leverage that 47 years of Iranian foreign policy was built upon. You cannot unbuild a railway. You cannot mine a land route. You cannot threaten a steel pipeline running through Iraq with a fast attack boat. And the regime in Tehran, which has spent 4 decades telling the world that its control of the Strait of Hormuz makes it untouchable, is now watching the world's response to that claim materialize not in the form of more warships, but in the form of construction equipment, financing agreements, and 3 simultaneous mega-projects that will collectively make the question of who controls the strait irrelevant to the global economy within the decade. But let's back all the way up. Because to understand why the 3 infrastructure projects now advancing simultaneously across the Middle East represent a more permanent and more comprehensive defeat for Iranian strategic doctrine than anything happening on the water, you need to understand what the Hormuz leverage card actually was, why it worked for 4 decades, and what specifically it required to remain effective. And understanding that is understanding exactly what these 3 projects are each designed to remove. Here's where things stand as of May 13th, 2026. Nearly 2,000 massive oil tankers and commercial vessels remain trapped in or around the Strait of Hormuz, held in place by the combination of Iranian threats, active mining operations, and the IRGC's declared control over which vessels it will permit to transit. The International Maritime Organization has confirmed the paralysis. 73 Iranian tankers carrying cargo worth over $13 billion are sitting motionless in the Gulf, unable to deliver, unable to convert their cargo into the revenue the regime needs to function. More than 230 loaded tankers belonging to non-Iranian Gulf producers are trapped inside the strait, unable to reach their buyers. The Houthis in Yemen, coordinating directly with Tehran, have activated the southern gateway of the Red Sea at Bab el-Mandeb with missiles and drone attacks on commercial shipping, creating a double blockade that has paralyzed the entire supply chain stretching from Asia to Europe. Oil prices have surged above $115 per barrel. Freight costs have increased by 500%. The global economy is losing billions of dollars every hour the paralysis holds. A locked down system, a tightening noose, a geopolitical choke on the arteries of global trade. And here is the detail that the IRGC's strategic communications have been emphasizing to every audience it can reach. 20% of the world's entire seaborne oil supply passes through the 33-kilometer Strait of Hormuz every single day. 20 million barrels every day. There's no substitute. There's no alternative. Without the strait, the global economy has no path. That argument, made by Iranian officials for 4 decades with enough factual foundation to give it real coercive weight, is the argument that 3 simultaneous megaprojects are now being built specifically to make permanently, irreversibly, and completely false. Now let's get into what the world's response to the parking lot actually looks like. Because the response is not what most coverage of this conflict has been leading with, and it is the response that will matter 10 years from now far more than any ceasefire agreement that emerges from the current diplomatic track. 3 projects, each attacking the Hormuz leverage card from a different geographic angle, each making a different component of Iran's maritime strategy obsolete. Together, they represent what historians will eventually call the permanent answer to the question the IRGC has been weaponizing since 1979. What happens to the world economy if we close the strait? The answer being constructed right now, with financing agreements signed and construction timelines established, is nothing. Because the strait will no longer be necessary. The first project is the one that should be keeping the IRGC's Strategic Planning Directorate awake at 3 in the morning, because it is the most direct and the most elegant neutralization of the Hormuz threat ever proposed, and it is being advanced with a seriousness and a financial commitment that previous iterations of this concept never achieved. The Hajar Mountains Canal project, the Hormuz Bypass Canal, a 32-kilometer waterway that will be carved directly through the rugged mountain terrain of Oman's Musandam Peninsula, connecting the Persian Gulf to the Sea of Oman without passing through a single meter of Iranian-controlled or Iranian-threatened waters. Read that again, slowly. A canal through a mountain, not around Iranian waters. not under diplomatic protection from Iranian threats, through a mountain, where Iranian fast attack boats cannot operate, where Iranian mines cannot be laid, where Iranian anti-ship missiles have no target to acquire, where IRGC drone swarms cannot fly inside a secured channel carved into solid rock. The geographic logic of this project is the most devastating single response to Iranian maritime doctrine that engineering can produce. Iran's entire Hormuz leverage strategy is built on the physical reality that ships traveling between the Persian Gulf and the open ocean have exactly one route available to them. This canal creates a second route. The leverage disappears the moment the second route exists, because leverage built on geographic choke points only holds when the choke point is the only option. Remove the only option condition, and the leverage dissipates as completely as if the strait itself had been relocated. The engineering parameters of this project deserve the specific attention they warrant, because the scale of what is being proposed is not a theoretical sketch. It is a detailed engineering specification developed with the precision that a $100 billion investment requires. The canal will be exactly 32 kilometers long, running through the interior of the Hajar Mountains, whose peaks reach 650 meters. The channel will be 25 meters deep and 300 meters wide. Those dimensions were not chosen arbitrarily. They were calculated specifically to accommodate the world's largest supertankers, the VLCC and ULCC class vessels that carry the bulk of the Gulf's oil export volume, passing through with navigational margin sufficient for safety. 400 million cubic meters of rock will be excavated to create this channel. To provide context for that number, the Suez Canal's entire construction involved approximately 74 million cubic meters of excavation. This project removes more than 5 times that volume from solid mountain rock. 3 lock systems, each 400 meters long and 60 meters wide, will manage the water level differences between the Persian Gulf and the Sea of Oman. The project's price tag ranges between $100 and $300 billion, depending on which engineering assessment is being referenced. And that price tag, which appears enormous in isolation, becomes a profoundly rational investment when measured against what the global economy loses every hour the current Hormuz paralysis holds. Billions of dollars per hour, hundreds of billions per month, trillions over the course of the decade in which this canal could be built. The arithmetic of why this investment is being seriously advanced does not require complex economic modeling. It requires only the observation that the cost of building the canal is small relative to the cost of not having it. Now let's talk about what this canal does to Iranian strategic doctrine at its most fundamental level, because the specific capabilities that the IRGC has spent decades developing and deploying are each individually nullified by the canal's operating environment. The IRGC's fast attack boat doctrine depends on confined open water. The canal is not open water. It is a controlled channel inside a mountain through which ships transit under specific regulated conditions. There is no swarm formation possible in a 32-meter wide channel where a supertanker occupies most of the navigable width. The IRGC's mine-laying strategy depends on access to the waterway being mined. The canal is secured corridor infrastructure with physical access control that no hostile state actor can penetrate without direct military action against the territory of Oman, which is protected by its own sovereignty and by the security partnerships it has maintained with precisely the countries that would be using the canal. The IRGC's anti-ship missile batteries on the Iranian coastline depend on ships being in the strait's waters to acquire as targets. Ships inside the Hajar Mountains Canal are inside a mountain. There is no line of sight from Iran's coast to the inside of a tunnel. The targeting solution does not exist. Iran's leverage in the Strait of Hormuz could vanish by as much as 80% the moment this canal reaches operational status. Not reduced, not degraded, vanished. Because the strategic value of controlling a choke point is a function of how many ships need to use it. When the canal is operational, the ships that use it never enter Iranian-threatened waters. The choke point still exists geographically. It simply becomes irrelevant commercially. And commercially irrelevant strategic leverage is not leverage at all. It is geography with no power attached to it. The economic transformation that this canal enables extends well beyond the oil export problem it solves. The Strait of Hormuz is not just an oil transit route. It is the primary maritime corridor for all commercial shipping between the Persian Gulf and the global ocean. Container ships, bulk carriers, general cargo vessels. Every ship moving goods from Gulf economies to world markets currently has no choice but to transit the strait. The canal eliminates that constraint for all categories of shipping simultaneously. Oman and the UAE would become the anchors of a new global logistics hub, a canal city and port complex at the Sea of Oman terminus that could rival the significance of the Suez Canal zone to the global shipping industry. China's Belt and Road Initiative, which has been investing in port infrastructure across the Indian Ocean for a decade, would have a compelling reason to integrate into the canal's terminal infrastructure, given its central role in connecting Gulf supply chains to Asian markets. The risk premiums generated by the current crisis, the insurance surcharges, the freight cost spikes, the oil price volatility that translates into inflation in every energy importing economy would decline towards zero for shipping that uses the canal route because the route has no Iranian threat exposure. The wild fluctuations in global energy prices that the IRGC has been exploiting as a form of economic warfare would lose their driving mechanism. The canal does not just bypass the strait. It removes the threat environment that makes strait transit expensive, and removing that threat environment removes the IRGC's ability to impose costs on the global economy through the threat of strait interference, regardless of whether the canal carries every barrel of Gulf oil or only a portion of it. The threat loses its teeth when a credible alternative exists, because markets will price the alternative into every calculation, and the IRGC's blackmail premium disappears. Now let's shift to the second mega project, because this one is not a concept design or an engineering proposal. It has financing agreements signed, it has construction timelines established, it has the formal commitment of 4 sovereign governments, and it is advancing toward reality on a timeline that the current Hormuz crisis has dramatically accelerated from a long-term infrastructure ambition into an urgent geopolitical necessity. The Iraq Development Road, an internationally agreed project that will position Iraq and Turkey at the center of global trade in a way that changes the entire economic geography of the Middle East. The project begins at the Grand Fa port on Iraq's Persian Gulf coastline, a deep-water port facility specifically designed to be the Gulf terminus of a transcontinental trade corridor. From Fa, a combination of highway and high-capacity railway infrastructure runs the full length of Iraqi territory, approximately 1,200 kilometers, before crossing into Turkey. From the Turkish border, the corridor connects to the Mediterranean port of Mersin, and through the Kapakul border crossing in Bulgaria, reaches the arterial infrastructure of the European market. Read the geographic logic of that route carefully. Cargo leaving the Persian Gulf at Fa loads onto trains rather than tankers. Those trains traverse Iraq and Turkey on land routes that are not accessible to naval mines, not targetable by sea-skimming anti-ship missiles, not threatened by fast attack boat swarms, and not subject to any form of Iranian maritime leverage whatsoever. The cargo arrives in Europe having never entered the Strait of Hormuz, having never entered any body of water the IRGC controls or threatens, having traveled entirely on land infrastructure through sovereign nations with their own territorial integrity and their own military deterrence postures that have nothing to do with what happens in the Persian Gulf. The project's operational parameters define both its ambition and its strategic significance. The corridor is designed to handle 7.5 million containers per day once fully operational. 33 million tons of bulk cargo flowing safely from the Gulf to Europe annually. The total project cost has been estimated at approximately $17 billion, which represents a fraction of the canal project's price tag, while delivering a comparable strategic outcome for land-based cargo. The financing agreement between Turkey, Iraq, Qatar, and the United Arab Emirates represents the most concrete evidence that the project has moved from the planning phase to the implementation phase. A historic agreement on the financing model has been reached. A financing pool is being established. Construction is set to begin. These are not ambiguous diplomatic statements about future cooperation. They are the institutional commitments of 4 governments with aligned strategic and economic interests in seeing this corridor become operational as quickly as possible. For Iraq, this project represents an economic transformation of a scale not seen since the country's oil sector was first developed. Iraq would become a transcontinental transit country, earning revenue from every container and every barrel that crosses its territory, developing the logistics infrastructure that makes that transit possible, and attracting the foreign investment that follows trade route development historically. A country that has spent 20 years rebuilding from conflict suddenly becoming a central node in the global supply chain is an economic trajectory that every Iraqi government since 2003 has sought without finding the catalyzing mechanism. The Hormuz crisis and the urgent global need for Gulf trade alternatives is that mechanism. For Turkey, the project completes the country's geographic destiny as the bridge between East and West in the most literal physical sense, not as a diplomatic metaphor. As a 1,200-kilometer steel corridor through which the goods of the world's most energy-productive region reach the consumption markets of the world's wealthiest continent, Turkey has spent a decade positioning itself as a logistics hub. The development road makes it won by structural necessity rather than by political ambition alone. For Qatar and the UAE, the project provides the land-based trade alternative that removes their economic exposure to Iranian-Hormuz coercion more effectively than any military arrangement could. Once the Fall corridor is operational, Qatari and Emirati exports to Europe do not require the strait. The threat loses its economic relevance to these 2 economies simultaneously. The third project is the most geopolitically charged of the 3. And it is charged precisely because it represents the formation of the alliance that the Islamic Republic's entire regional strategy was designed to prevent from ever forming. The proposed pipeline network connecting Saudi Arabia's oil fields to Israel's Mediterranean port of Haifa, enabling Gulf crude to reach European markets through the shortest and most direct land route without any maritime transit at all. To understand why this specific project is the one that represents the deepest strategic disruption to Iranian regional doctrine, you need to understand what that doctrine was originally designed to prevent. The IRGC's Ring of Fire proxy strategy, the investment in Hezbollah, the Houthis, the Iraqi militias, the Syrian presence, was not primarily designed to threaten Israel militarily. It was designed to maintain a permanent state of regional instability that prevented the normalization of Saudi-Israeli economic and strategic relationships. Because a Saudi-Israeli normalized relationship, combined with Gulf capital and Israeli technology and Mediterranean port access, creates a regional economic architecture that completely bypasses Iranian involvement, Iranian leverage, and Iranian geographic significance. The Abraham Accords were the beginning of that normalization. The Development Road's Turkey-Iraq component is the northern leg of the alternative corridor architecture, and the Saudi-Haifa pipeline is the direct financial and strategic partnership between the two powers whose alignment Iran has spent 40 years and hundreds of billions of dollars in proxy financing specifically to prevent. The proposal places Israel in the role of the reliable energy corridor hub for European markets, providing Saudi Arabia and other Gulf producers with Mediterranean export access through the safest and most direct overland route available. The advantages of this positioning are not only economic, they are political in a way that reshapes the regional architecture the IRGC depends upon for its deterrence posture. Iran, rather than engaging in direct warfare against these projects, may attempt to sever these new land-based arteries using the asymmetric methods it has deployed at sea across 4 decades. The long-range kamikaze drones capable of crossing borders could appear over construction sites. Cyber attacks on pipeline management systems could disrupt operations. Proxy forces in Iraq, the remnants of Iranian-backed militias, whose financial lifeline from Tehran has been cut by the blockade, could attempt sabotage operations against development road infrastructure. These risks are real. They are being factored into the security architecture being built around each project. And they are the reason that the security partnerships required to protect these corridors are themselves reshaping the regional alignment landscape in ways that further reduce Iranian strategic relevance. A Saudi-Israeli security partnership protecting a shared pipeline is also a Saudi-Israeli strategic alliance against the threat that motivated the sabotage. A Turkish-Iraqi security cooperation framework protecting the development road is also a bilateral relationship that makes Iranian interference in Iraqi territory a direct affront to Turkish interests, which is a different deterrence calculation than Iran has previously faced in Iraq. The projects are not just infrastructure. They are the physical foundations of new strategic alignments, and the alignments they create are aligned against the specific threat the IRGC represents. Every pipeline section completed, every kilometer of railway track laid, every lock gate installed in the Hajar Mountains Canal is simultaneously a piece of infrastructure and a commitment by the nations behind it to defend that infrastructure from Iranian interference. That commitment is the security architecture that the IRGC cannot counter with fast attack boats or drone swarms, because the security framework protecting land infrastructure is not a naval problem. It is a land-based strategic deterrence problem. And the IRGC's remaining land-based deterrence capacity, after 75 days of Operation Epic Fury and the financial strangulation of the blockade, is not what it was when these projects were first conceived. Now let's talk about the active bypass routes that are already operating. Because while the 3 megaprojects represent the decade-long permanent answer to Iranian Hormuz leverage, the immediate operational response has already reduced the daily damage being absorbed by the global economy from the current crisis. The Saudi east-west pipeline, the Petroline, is the most immediately significant. This massive infrastructure, stretching 1,200 kilometers from the oil fields of Saudi Arabia's eastern province to the Red Sea port of Yanbu, was built specifically as the primary contingency against a Hormuz disruption scenario. The moment Iran closed the strait, the Saudis opened the valves completely. Currently, the pipeline is operating at its maximum engineered capacity of approximately 5 million barrels per day, with additional refined product volumes reaching international markets through Yanbu's export facilities. 5 million barrels per day from a single alternative route that was already built, already operational, and already tested. And the UAE is contributing its own operational bypass. The Habshan-Fujairah pipeline, approximately 400 kilometers of infrastructure running from Abu Dhabi's onshore oil production fields directly to the port of Fujairah on the Gulf of Oman, is currently delivering approximately 1.5 million barrels per day to export terminals that sit completely outside the Strait of Hormuz's threatened waters. Every barrel that leaves Fujairah is a barrel that has never required any negotiation with Iranian naval forces, never passed within range of IRGC fast attack boats, never traversed the 33-kilometer choke point where the IRGC has positioned its mines and missiles. When the Saudi and UAE active bypass capacities are combined, approximately 6.5 million barrels per day are currently reaching world markets completely independent of Iranian leverage. 6.5 million barrels per day that Iran cannot threaten, cannot tax through transit toll demands, cannot hold hostage, cannot use as economic leverage against the producing countries or the importing economies that receive them. The leverage card is already partially torn. The 3 megaprojects will finish tearing it completely. The honest operational assessment of where the bypass capacity stands today requires acknowledging the gap between what is currently available and what is needed. The Strait of Hormuz carries 20 million barrels of oil per day under normal conditions. The current combined bypass capacity of approximately 6.5 million barrels represents roughly 32% of that normal flow, significant enough to prevent complete global energy market collapse, insufficient to replace the strait entirely. The gap between 32% and 100% is the gap that the 3 megaprojects are being built to close, and it is also the gap that explains why oil prices remain above $115 per barrel despite the active bypass routes. The market is pricing the gap. The investment flows being mobilized to build the 3 megaprojects are priced to close the gap permanently. And the IRGC's strategic calculation that it can hold the world economy hostage through Hormuz indefinitely is a calculation that was accurate for 47 years, precisely because no credible combination of bypass capacity existed to close that gap. The combination being built right now changes that calculation permanently, not on the current crisis timeline, on the 10-year infrastructure timeline that makes every future crisis of this type a manageable disruption rather than an existential economic threat. Now let's bring the 3 tracks together into the complete strategic picture of what May 13th, 2026 actually represents for the long-term trajectory of Iranian power in the region. The financial track operating right now is the blockade, $500 million per day in accumulated revenue loss, 73 tankers going nowhere, a 71-kilometer oil slick off Karg Island, wells approaching the shutdown threshold that damages the asset permanently, the CIA's 3 to 4 month endurance window running against the IRGC's institutional survival calculus. That is the immediate financial track, and it is catastrophic for the regime's near-term operational capacity. But there's a second financial track operating on a different timeline that is more consequential for the regime's long-term strategic position. The investment flows being mobilized for the 3 megaprojects are drawing capital that was previously priced around the Hormuz risk premium. Insurance companies that have been paying out on Hormuz disruption claims for 47 years will finance infrastructure that removes their Hormuz exposure. Sovereign wealth funds in the Gulf states that have been tolerating Hormuz leverage as a constraint on their economic freedom for 4 decades are now writing the checks to eliminate that constraint permanently. Western institutional investors, who have been discounting Gulf energy assets for the Hormuz risk factor since the first tanker war in the 1980s, are now pricing those assets toward a future where the risk factor approaches 0. The capital mobilization for the bypass infrastructure is the financial market's permanent verdict on the IRGC's leverage strategy. The markets have decided the leverage is not permanent. They are funding its replacement. And market capital, once committed to infrastructure that makes a threat obsolete, does not reverse its commitment because the threat issues new statements about closing straits and opening gates of hell. The money is already moving toward the infrastructure that makes those statements irrelevant. The military track is what the blockade and Operation Epic Fury have been demonstrating for 75 days. But the military track's permanent contribution to the 3 megaprojects is not the destruction of Iranian naval assets. It is the establishment of the security architecture that makes the projects buildable. Saudi Arabia does not build a pipeline to Haifa in an environment where Hezbollah has full operational capability. Iranian proxy forces in Iraq are fully funded and equipped, and the IRGC's air and naval power is intact. The military track has addressed all 3 of those conditions simultaneously. Hezbollah is experiencing funding cutoffs as Iranian financial flows dry up. Iraqi militia capacity has been degraded by both American strikes and the financial strangulation that has cut Tehran's ability to pay the salaries that sustain those militias' loyalty. The IRGC's air and naval power has been reduced to a mosquito fleet hiding in coastal caves, and state media statements about gates of hell. The security environment for building the pipeline to Haifa, the railway through Iraq, and the canal through the Hajar Mountains has been improved by the same military campaign that is enforcing the blockade. The military and infrastructure tracks are not parallel stories. They are sequential phases of the same strategic transformation. Degrade the threat, build the bypass, make the threat permanently irrelevant. The psychological track is the three megaprojects' most important contribution to the strategic picture, because the psychological impact of these projects operates on the IRGC's own internal decision-making in ways that the blockade and military pressure cannot fully reach. The blockade creates economic pain. The military campaign creates physical destruction. But the infrastructure projects create strategic despair, the recognition within the IRGC's planning apparatus that the trajectory has permanently moved against its core leverage position. Every financing agreement signed for the development road tells the IRGC that Iraq, which Iranian-backed militias have been operating in for 2 decades, is choosing economic integration over proxy loyalty. Every engineering study advanced for the Hajar Mountains Canal tells the IRGC that Oman, which has historically served as a back-channel diplomatic conduit between Iran and the West, has decided the economic case for neutralizing Hormuz leverage outweighs the diplomatic value of maintaining ambiguity. Every discussion of the Haifa pipeline tells the IRGC that the Saudi-Israeli normalization it has invested billions in preventing is not only proceeding, but being accelerated by the crisis the IRGC created. The three projects are the world's strategic community telling Tehran simultaneously from 3 different geographic directions that the move you made to deploy your trump card has triggered the activation of the permanent counter that makes your trump card worthless. And that message, once received by an organization whose entire power architecture is built on the leverage of a single geographic choke point, produces a strategic despair that no amount of state media victory footage can counteract. Here is the honest assessment of the timeline and the risks, because intellectual rigor requires acknowledging what the 3 megaprojects cannot do and when they will and will not be available to reshape the strategic picture. The Hajar Mountains Canal, at $100 to $300 billion and requiring the excavation of 400 million cubic meters of solid rock from a mountain range, is a decade-scale project under optimistic assumptions. Even with the unprecedented urgency the current crisis has created, the engineering challenges, the financing mobilization requirements, the construction timeline for infrastructure of this complexity, place the canal's full operational availability well beyond the current conflict's resolution window. The canal changes the strategic future. It does not change the current operational picture. The development road, at $17 billion with financing already committed, and a construction timeline that is more tractable than the canal, is a 5 to 7 year project at aggressive execution pace. Its strategic impact begins when it is operational, not when the financing agreement is signed. The Saudi-Israeli pipeline faces the most complex political pathway of the 3, requiring a formal normalization agreement, security frameworks for protecting infrastructure, running through multiple jurisdictions, and the diplomatic resolution of questions that the Abraham Accords process had been advancing before the current crisis reshuffled regional political priorities. These are not obstacles that eliminate the project. They are obstacles that define its realistic timeline as measured in years rather than months. The Iranian regime that is experiencing the blockade's consequences right now will not be operating in a landscape reshaped by completed bypass infrastructure in the weeks and months that determine the current conflict's outcome. But the timeline distinction between the immediate crisis and the long-term infrastructure transformation does not diminish the strategic significance of the projects. It clarifies it. The blockade and the military campaign are fighting a battle. The 3 mega-projects are ending a war, not the current conflict between American naval forces and the IRGC's Mosquito fleet, the 47-year war between Iranian geographic leverage and the global economy's tolerance for that leverage. That war has been running since the IRGC first deployed the Hormuz card as a serious policy tool in the early 1980s, and it has been running in Iran's favor because the geographic reality of the Strait's chokepoint function gave the leverage real economic weight that no diplomatic or military response could permanently eliminate. The projects eliminate it permanently, not by defeating Iran militarily, not by changing the geography of the Strait, by building an alternative geography that makes the Strait's chokepoint function commercially unnecessary. And once commercially unnecessary, the chokepoint's leverage disappears, not because Iran has been defeated, but because the market has moved on to infrastructure that does not involve Iran's geographic position in its value chain. History's verdict on geographic leverage is instructive here and directly applicable to the current moment. For 2,000 years, the Silk Road routes through Central Asia created leverage for whatever powers controlled those routes. When ocean navigation became reliable and scalable in the 15th and 16th centuries, that land route leverage evaporated, not because Central Asian powers were militarily defeated, but because the maritime alternative made the land route commercially optional. The powers that had built their strategic position on controlling the land routes did not lose in a military confrontation. They became irrelevant to the trade flows that had sustained their strategic significance. The Strait of Hormuz, as a strategic leverage tool, is approaching the same inflection point. The world is not defeating Iran's straight leverage militarily, though the military campaign is certainly degrading Iranian naval capacity that would otherwise defend that leverage. The world is building the maritime and land route alternatives that make the strait commercially optional. Once commercially optional, the leverage becomes a historical footnote rather than a present strategic reality, and the IRGC, which has structured its entire strategic doctrine around that leverage, will need to find a new source of coercive power in a world where its primary leverage card has been rendered commercially obsolete by engineering and capital. There is one additional dimension of this picture that deserves the attention it is not receiving. The 2,000 ships currently stranded in and around the Strait of Hormuz are not just a crisis statistic. They are the most expensive and most visible demonstration of supply chain vulnerability that the global economy has experienced since the COVID-19 pandemic disrupted manufacturing networks worldwide. And the COVID-19 experience produced exactly what the current Hormuz crisis is producing: a global recognition that dependency on single choke points, whether those are manufacturing geographies or maritime transit routes, is a structural risk that requires structural mitigation. After COVID, every major economy accelerated supply chain diversification initiatives. After the Hormuz crisis, every major economy is accelerating infrastructure investment in Hormuz bypass capacity. The decision is not being made by governments deliberating in slow diplomatic processes. It is being made by insurance companies adjusting their risk models, by freight operators recalculating their route economics, by sovereign wealth funds updating their infrastructure investment criteria, by engineering firms finalizing feasibility studies for projects that were previously classified as interesting long-term possibilities and are now being treated as urgent near-term necessities. The capital is moving. The engineering is advancing. The financing frameworks are being established. And the IRGC's 47-year trump card is experiencing the financial market's most definitive verdict. Not a diplomatic rejection, not a military defeat, a capital allocation decision that funds its permanent replacement. The 2,000 ships stranded in the Strait of Hormuz are, as the analysis of the current situation compels us to recognize, the last generation of vessels whose commercial vulnerability to Iranian geographic leverage represents a structural feature of the global trading system rather than a temporary crisis condition. The ships that transit the Hajar Mountains Canal when it opens will never be hostage to the IRGC's fast attack boats. The cargo that travels the development road will never be targeted by Iranian anti-ship missiles. The oil that flows through the Haifa pipeline will never generate the Hormuz risk premium that has been embedded in global energy prices for 47 years. And the IRGC, which built its strategic doctrine, its regional proxy empire, its political dominance over the Iranian state, its deterrence posture against the United States and its Gulf neighbors on the foundation of geographic leverage over a 33-kilometer waterway, will be left with a leverage card whose purchasing power in the global strategic market has been reduced to zero by the same combination of capital, engineering, and political will that its own most aggressive deployment of that card finally activated. The arrow has left the bow. The world is not waiting for diplomacy to resolve the crisis before building the infrastructure that makes the next crisis impossible to create in the same way. The question is no longer whether the Hormuz leverage card can be made permanently obsolete. It is already being made obsolete in construction contracts and financing agreements and engineering specifications being finalized in conference rooms that the IRGC's intelligence apparatus is tracking with the specific and justified anxiety of an organization watching the only strategic asset it has left being systematically undermined by the very crisis it created to deploy that asset. The question worth asking right now, the one that sits at the intersection of the current conflict and the infrastructure transformation accelerating alongside it, is this: does the IRGC's leadership, the commanders making the decisions that produced the parking lot at Karg Island and the 71-kilometer oil slick and the garbage proposal that Trump threw back, understand that what they have triggered is not a crisis that ends with a negotiated agreement and returns to a baseline where the Hormuz leverage card can be redeployed in the next confrontation? Or are they calculating that a ceasefire agreement will restore the pre-conflict strategic architecture, stop the infrastructure projects, preserve the leverage, and allow the same card to be played again in 5 or 10 years? If the second calculation is what is driving Iranian resistance to the terms that would end the blockade, it is the most consequential strategic miscalculation the IRGC has made since the Iraq War, because the infrastructure projects that the Hormuz crisis has activated will continue, regardless of how the current conflict resolves. A ceasefire will not stop the financing for the development road. A nuclear deal will not cancel the engineering studies for the Hajar Mountains Canal. A diplomatic resolution will not reverse the Saudi decision to route more oil through the east-west pipeline. The projects are moving because the crisis demonstrated permanently what the next crisis would demonstrate if the projects were not built. And the global capital markets, having made that demonstration the basis for a permanent infrastructure investment decision, will not reverse the investment because the current confrontation found a diplomatic resolution. The leverage card has been played, the world has decided not to live with it anymore, and the infrastructure it is funding to replace its vulnerability to that leverage is the most honest, most permanent, and most strategically decisive response to 47 years of IRGC blackmail that has ever been committed to concrete and steel and financing agreements. Drop your analysis in the comments. Which of these three projects, the Hajar Mountains Canal, the Iraq-Turkey Development Road, or the Saudi-Haifa pipeline, changes the strategic map most permanently when it is completed? And what is Iran's next move when it realizes that the trump card it has deployed is being replaced, not defeated? Subscribe and turn on notifications. The infrastructure story is moving on a slower timeline than the military and diplomatic story, but it is the story that will matter most when the current conflict is history.